To begin with, welcome everyone and thanks for joining us today. Axiom hosts a quarterly webinar on how data is being used to transform commercial refrigeration. This is our Q3 2024 installation of that webinar series. We wanted to highlight a couple items as we get started, housekeeping stuff. As attendees on the webinar, your camera will be turned off and everyone will be muted. If you have questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can enter questions there. A Q&A session will follow today's conversation. We've set aside time for that, and we'll address questions at that time. We are recording today's presentation, and we're going to make it available when it's ready, typically around 1 week from today. And if you hear or see something from our panelists today that you'd like more information about, feel free to send us an email and we can set up a one-on-one anytime. So a really important piece about this is that this is not a sales pitch for Axiom nor FactStarted Trakref. Instead, this is an opportunity to have an industry conversation about a highly relevant and urgent topic, which is the recent EPA ruling that's making the refrigerant management rocket to the top of all of our priority lists. Instead of being a sales pitch, we're starting this conversation with retailers and suppliers, and the goal is to learn from each other about refrigerant leak repair, detection, avoidance, and programmatic management. And our goal is to help participants evaluate ways to achieve compliance, improve their own leak rates, and drive a great ROI. If you only take away one thing from today's discussion, it should be this: the time to start developing your strategy to comply with the AIM Act is right now. Not only is the regulatory deadline coming up fast, but this is also an incredible opportunity to solve perhaps our industry's greatest operational, financial, sustainability, and cost problem, which is high refrigerant leak rates. So with that, we'll do a couple of quick intros and jump right in. My name's Amrit. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Axiom Cloud. I've been helping grocery chains and large commercial refrigerated facilities optimize refrigeration for over 10 years now. Refrigeration is a really exciting topic for me because it is a massive climate opportunity and a financial opportunity. It's a really underserved category in a lot of ways. We started Axiom Cloud, I guess, about 4 years ago at this point, to solve the biggest problems plaguing this space using software, automation, and AI. And I'm more excited about our recently announced, I guess now year and a half old, early leak detection module than any of the other new technologies that we've introduced in the refrigeration industry in my 10 years in the space. So, we're already providing leak detection in hundreds and hundreds of sites today. And the reason I'm talking about this in a way that sounds salesy is because I'm personally really excited about the climate impact that we're able to have with this leak detection. It's increased Axiom's greenhouse gas impacts by more than a factor of 11. So that's really motivating to me. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm in the space. And yeah, I'm really excited to be partnering with the industry and Stephen at FactStarted Trakref to talk through ALD and to talk through the AIM Act and leak management in general today. So Stephen.
Awesome. Thanks for having me here. Really appreciate it, Amrit. My name is Stephen Blumenfeld. I'm the general manager of Trakref. Trakref is a refrigerant management and tracking solution, really focused on helping owners and operators of refrigerant-containing equipment make sure that their records are audit-ready. So everything from asset inventory to leak inspections, leak repair, CARB filings, EPA, chronically leaking systems filings, all of that critical tasks that owners and operators need to do to remain in compliance can be handled via Trakref. So you can think of it kind of as your TurboTax or QuickBooks for your refrigerant management needs. Trakref is now part of FEXA. FEXA is a work order management solution, a CMMS system, and we're really excited to be kind of combining forces in what is ultimately, comes down to preventative maintenance work order management for these specialized systems, which are your refrigeration and HVAC systems. And on a personal note, I have focused my career in the clean tech space, focusing on heavily regulated industries, initially in the utility space. And I got so excited about this specific niche here because it is so impactful. If you think about what we are all working on together here to reduce the unintentional releases of these highly potent greenhouse gases, it's really exciting to think about the massive impact collectively that we can all have. So looking forward to discussing the evolving landscape with all of you, learning from many of you as well. Yeah, Amrit, take it from here.
All right, now we're done with the company intro, so let's talk about the problem. or let's talk about the agenda, I guess. So we're going to start by talking about why refrigerant leak rates are so important and reducing them. What are the new requirements in the AIM Act? What does a step-by-step plan look like to meet the compliance deadline? And then we're going to leave some time for Q&A at the end. So why are HFC leak reductions so important for grocery and cold storage? There's 4 key reasons why refrigerant leaks are really detrimental to our business models in the retail, grocery, and cold storage space. Obviously, there's the business continuity issue, where today, when you have a refrigerant leak and it goes all the way to its logical conclusion, which is the system running so low you can no longer meet temperature, then you have cooling outages. And that's extremely disruptive for shoppers, for employees, leads to lost sales, lost product, spoilage, et cetera, burnt out employees. Very painful. There's the cost element, where obviously a single leak can cost tens of thousands of dollars at this point, given just the price of gas, ignoring all the knock-on effects of labor, of lost sales, et cetera, et cetera. There's a sustainability element, where in many cases now, refrigerant leaks are the number one driver of Scope 1 emissions, and in many cases, one of the largest drivers of Scope 1 and 2 emissions. So the way that I think about the sustainability challenge here is each pound of gas that's lost is 2,000 to 5,000 times more potent than CO2. So you lose 1 to 3 pounds of this stuff, and that's equivalent to driving a car for a year. And then the average supermarket in the US, according to the EPA, is leaking around 800 pounds of this stuff per year. So you multiply the potency by the leak rate, that is a climate crisis all on its own. And so that's the opportunity that we have as a industry, the group of folks here on the call today, to address, is this incredibly high leverage climate opportunity. And then on the compliance side, obviously there's EPA, there's CARB, and I believe there's 12 other states now that are really cracking down on refrigerant leaks because they understand the magnitude of this opportunity. And one of the really cool parts of this is that we're not dealing with 300 million tailpipes to reduce emissions. We're dealing with 40,000 grocery stores. And like the fact that it's many orders of magnitude smaller number of point sources makes this such a more attractive opportunity for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. All right, let's go to the next one here. Stephen, you want to talk about this, where we are today?
Sure. So, the grocery industry has been focusing on managing and reducing the leak rates of their refrigerant for a long time now. And partially it's because it is very costly. Amrit was just describing some of the risks in terms of food spoilage, operational issues, not to mention the price of refrigerant has been going up massively by design, right? As part of the phase outs that we're seeing under the Montreal Protocol that has been around for decades, and the enacting legislation to better manage the production and consumption of these fluorinated gases. We're really focusing on helping operators keep their commercial refrigeration beneath 20%, which is kind of seen as the trigger rate for leak rates. And when we look at the different ESG reports that are coming out of industry leaders, we can see that 50% or more of a store's Scope 1 and 2 emissions is due to refrigerant leaks. Interestingly, just the retail giant Walmart put out their sustainability report, and Scope 1 emissions from fugitive emissions from refrigerant leakage were the majority of their Scope 1 emissions and made up over a quarter of their combined Scope 1 and 2 emissions. So if that is for Walmart, imagine what it is for someone who does. We're seeing rates of grocery at 50% or more. So it's massively impactful and a great area to focus on, especially as companies are thinking about how to achieve their long-term commitments to reducing their emissions profile.
Yeah, the opportunity for improvement here is staggering. So let's break this down a little bit and just look at one individual leak. So on this graph that I'm showing here, obviously the y-axis, the vertical axis, is cost. And then the x-axis, the horizontal axis, is time. And this is not hours or days, it's just kind of unitless time. So typically, as you think about the life cycle of a leak, over time, the impacts of that leak get worse and worse, and they begin to multiply as you get closer and closer to running out of gas entirely. Typically, leaks today are caught at 0.7, right here, where you have these consequential losses beginning. In other words, you have temperature issues. So suddenly the display cases or the walk-ins that are evaporators that are furthest away from the rack, and they start seeing more and more bubbles in their liquid column. And before you know it, they're not meeting temperature set points or getting temperature alarms. At that point, by 0.7, you've already lost the vast majority of refrigerant in that system. And it's basically too late. You're already in a reactive emergency situation. And so very simply, one of the most important elements of this entire process of lowering refrigerant leak rates is catching leaks earlier, over here at 0.2. That's one of the most important things that we're going to talk about more today. So this is saving on the sustainability, on the operational, on the cost, and on the compliance side in a big way. Just simply moving from 0.7 to 0.2. So let's keep going. Stephen, you want to talk about the AIM Act?
Sure. So the AIM Act was what we are all focusing on today. This was signed into law as bipartisan legislation, signed into law by President Trump in December of 2020. As we've discussed, the impact just in terms of tons of CO2 equivalent is massive here. And so a huge opportunity to make a meaningful and enduring impact on collective emissions and how we address the climate crisis. And on this note, I would say overall regulation of CFCs and HFCs has been part of a long, very promising track record of cooperation between multiple industry stakeholders, governing bodies at state, federal, and international levels. And that, I think, can give us all a lot of hope that as an industry, we can come together, we can set achievable targets, and then follow through with the technology and processes necessary to meet these objectives. Now, in terms of the specific timing here, we have all read the draft framework of Section H, which is the management portion of the AIM Act. That was released about a year ago in October of last year. So we are waiting with bated breath for the finalization, which we are expecting, I think, literally any day now. EPA has said by end of summer. I've heard that while the equinox is only a couple days away, that perhaps the EPA defines end of summer by the end of September. So we'll see. Regardless, there are a number of things that we can learn just from the proposed language that can help us better prepare. So I guess with that, why don't we turn to the next slide? And specifically, subsection H is the management plan. And already we've seen the phase down rule, subsection E of the AIM Act, set the production and consumption controls. So essentially, the step down of the kind of most harmful from a GWP perspective, HFCs and refrigerants. And then the technology transitions rule applied specific restrictions to specific sectors and subsectors. And what subsection H does, and this is what will be finalized any day now, is really focus on maximizing reclamation and minimizing release of the HFCs. So as other portions of the AIM Act control the supply of these refrigerants, subsection H is really focused on how do we manage what's already in the field? How do we manage the existing fleet of assets, the existing refrigerant, so that we're making best use of everything that is out there and releasing and minimizing the potential for harmful releases. One thing to note is that subsection H meaningfully broadens the scope of the assets that are subject to these refrigerant management requirements. I'm sure everyone on this webinar is well aware of the decades of regulation that have already been in place under Section 608 of the Clean Air Act, which have really focused on ozone-depleting substances and generally set the charge size at 50 pounds and above. Granted, there have been other restrictions on disposal for smaller assets, but for the most part, most refrigerant management at both the federal and state levels have focused on assets at 50-pound charge size and above. What's really important to know and prepare for is that subsection H, while we're kind of still waiting on the final numbers, there's every indication there that it will meaningfully broaden the scope in two ways. One is broadening the material type subject to these regulations. So not only looking at ozone depleting substances, class 1 and class 2, but also looking at the GWP and setting a GWP threshold of 53, which I'll note is lower than what we've seen out of the Washington state regulations and CARB. It's also looking at smaller assets, so broadening the scope from just 50 pounds and up to now potentially 15 pounds and up. We'll see where that final rule lands. There was some speculation that it could go as low as 5 pounds, though 15 pounds is what was suggested in the kind of proposed rule and what the EPA received comments on. But regardless, there are meaningful steps that owners and operators can take to prepare to comply with these new management practices and to better understand how it's going to impact their operations across a number of areas. So this includes leak repair requirements, leak inspections, retrofit and retirement plans, record keeping and reporting, automated leak detection, and then also thinking about how you're going to manage now disposable cylinders, which subsection H notes must be sent to a reclaimer, again, to prevent what is often the most harmful aspect of the life cycle here, which is end of life, making sure that those gases are retrieved and reclaimed so that they can stay in beneficial use rather than escape and have the negative environmental consequences thereof.
Yeah, well put. So now we know more about actual subsection H and what it includes, and there are some really significant changes. And so I didn't mean to send that note out during Stephen's slide. Apologies for that. I pressed send a little too early there. But basically, the next question is, do I need to start thinking about this now, or can I wait? And so we put together a little calculator just to give folks a sense of, what is the timeline here? And let me think about the scope of what needs to happen from the perspective of my organization. And so I dropped that link into the chat here. But basically, if you're just doing some simple back of the envelope math and you're looking at the total number of sites in your portfolio today, the percentage of those sites that require automatic leak detection and other things under the AIM Act, and then you think about how long is it going to take for me to contract with a new vendor, including things like legal, IT interconnection, procurement, et cetera. There's not a lot of time here because ultimately this regulation is coming out supposedly this calendar month, September. And the EPA has signaled there's going to be a 12-month compliance period. So that means that by the end of next September 2025, this needs to be deployed across all eligible facilities. That's not a lot of time. And so we want to give folks a sense of like, hey, it's time to start thinking about this, planning for it, considering options now. Stephen, do you want to talk a little bit about the kind of percentage of sites that you've seen where this is going to be applicable?
Yeah, so what we've seen, and there are many different aspects to the AIM Act, but I think some of the specific leak repair, leak inspection, and reporting requirements, they kick in at certain leak rate thresholds. And what we've seen, generally speaking here, is about 25% of assets that we've seen in our massive data set of hundreds of thousands of assets report leak rates that exceed that threshold. And we actually assume that as a result, industry averages are probably higher because you've got to imagine that customers who are already making use of a refrigerant management platform are using more sophisticated management practices than the vast majority of assets that are out in the field. And so what that means is that owners and operators of those systems need to be prepared to broaden those standard operating procedures to make sure that they're including all of the assets, inclusive of smaller assets, and then inclusive of other material types that may very well be subject to these requirements.
Yeah. So just thinking about if you have, let's say, 2,000 grocery stores in your portfolio, 25% of those facilities already have equipment that's chronically leaking and triggers requirements. And then there's another subset of sites that have that use more than 1,500 pounds of refrigerant in them. We have talked to a lot of grocers already, and we're hearing estimates of around 50% of sites are going to almost immediately they're going to trigger these requirements. And so, of course, this is going to be different for each individual portfolio of stores, each individual banner and chain. But this is not a small percentage. So this is a large number of stores that need to be acted on in a relatively short period of time. So, and then the question becomes, which of my facilities do these requirements apply to? Maybe been better to start with this one in retrospect here. But basically, you can see this full flow chart just to get a sense of how do you determine for each individual facility, does AMAC subsection H apply to this facility or not? Very simply, does it have a refrigerant type that is triggered? So a high global warming potential refrigerant. So 404A, 407A, even 448, 449, and many others, R22, et cetera. Beyond that, does it use more than 1,500 pounds of gas? And then even if the answer is no there, even if it's not, even if it is a smaller system, does it have a leak rate that is above this threshold that Stephen was talking about? And so all those specific numbers and things are in the flow chart. I just dropped that link into the chat if anyone's interested in taking a look at that. And again, this is going to be a roadmap for essentially you can put each one of your sites into this and then get a sense of, is this site going to be triggering regulations, yes or no? Of course, Stephen and I would be happy to help with that too, if there's questions about that. Let's go to the next slide here. So let's talk about leak detection methods that are commonly used. So we're going to zero in on leak detection and specifically with the topic being automatic leak detection for a second. And then we're going to turn over to refrigerant management and tracking and record keeping. And Stephen will talk more about that. So in terms of leak detection methods that are commonly used today, the most common method that we see in industry today is case temperature alarms. And so put simply, there's no leak detection involved. Grocery stores are waiting today until there is a critical temperature emergency in the facility, and then they're able to determine after the fact that, hey, there's been a leak here in this facility for, in many cases, a very long period of time. And now we're at a critical end state of this emergency where the facility has run out of gas, essentially, and is having issues providing cooling services. We're having case temperature issues. It's just not a great state of being. Quarterly manual leak checks. So these technically meet compliance requirements in some cases, but not in others today in California. And they will meet certain EPA level requirements under the AIM Act as well, but definitely not all of them. There's really significant drawbacks for these quarterly manual leak checks from an ROI standpoint and just from a leak rate standpoint. One of them being if you're only checking every 90 days, you might miss a leak for 89 days if that leak pops up right after one of these checks. But beyond that, this means that in many cases, you are very much dependent on, is this technician who's showing up to do the manual leak check, are they really putting in their best effort? And, are they being really, really careful to check every last potential leaking area? Or maybe they're really tired or they have 15 other service calls that are super high priority emergencies that are taking more of their headspace and time and energy that day. There's the single point gas detectors. So essentially, this is a little box that you bolt onto the wall in the mechanical room typically. And these provide a really important safety function because ultimately, if you have so much refrigerant leaking into the air that is displacing oxygen, that can cause human occupants to pass out. And that's really bad. And so there's that helps to comply with a lot of safety regulations. Unfortunately, these single point gas detectors are not a good solution for overall reductions of leak rates because they're only catching really huge leaks and only in enclosed spaces like the mechanical room. And so you're going to miss the majority of leaks using that strategy. However, this has been found, this is essentially a loophole in a lot of the existing regulations today at the state level, which is that if you have one of these single point gas detectors in California, for example, you're technically compliant with a lot of these regulations. The EPA is closing that loophole nationwide right now. So this is no longer going to be okay from a CARB AMAC standpoint. It's not going to be sufficient for leak detection, automatic leak detection. And finally, there's receiver level sensor threshold alarms. These can be really effective. The problem is that receiver level sensors, if you don't already have them pre-built in from the factory, retrofitting is an absolute nightmare. And so that immediately disqualifies over half of facilities out there in the field today, based on our experience. And then beyond that, even if you do have these sensors in place, the data coming off of them is incredibly noisy and difficult to interpret. So when you have a condenser split turning on or off, when you have a domestic hot water heat reclaim turning on or off, when you have different case groups coming in and out of hot gas defrost, causes huge swings in refrigerant levels within the receiver. And so this data becomes really noisy. You can set up all kinds of rules and alarms and things like that, and you end up getting so many false positives that a lot of times they're ignored because it's too much to manage for a team that has other priorities. And so this is another example of a solution that's been tried a lot, but really hasn't delivered the type of benefits that the EPA is seeking, and that honestly we as an industry should be seeking as well. So what are the compliant methods available today? They fall into two buckets according to the EPA. The first is called direct ALD systems, direct automatic leak detection. And so the EPA defines that as using sensors or hardware to monitor the concentration of refrigerants in the air. And so this is essentially a sniffer system. So it's sniffing the air, it's determining how many parts per million of refrigerant are in the air today. The EPA listed 8 direct ALD manufacturers in the AIM Act, Subsection H, that was released back in October 2023. And so the EPA is very clear that having a single point solution in the machine room doesn't cut it. You need to have a lot more sensors than that throughout the facility. And so in many cases, folks are going to be resorting to these multi-channel leak detectors, where you have 16 to 32 to 64 channels of little capillary tubes that are retrofitted and installed and routed throughout the facility that then feed back into a couple of sensors, centralized sensors. And so they're sniffing each one of those channels individually, on a cyclical basis. And so there's a lot of advantages to these type of systems. This is the fastest type of leak detection. You can detect a leak in minutes after it begins. You can pinpoint the leak location to wherever that sensor is, and it does provide that safety compliance as well. So it can provide that immediate alarm in case there is a real human safety issue. The other type of EPA compliant automatic leak detection method available today is called indirect. And according to the EPA, that's defined as using predictive analytics or software to monitor the real-time operating conditions of a refrigerant-based system to infer whether a leak is present. So put another way, using the existing data in that existing Copeland or Danfoss or Microthermo controller, those hundreds to thousands of real-time data streams, to determine if a leak is happening or not, without adding new hardware, without adding new sensors. There were 3 indirect ALD manufacturers listed by the EPA. And what's common here is that, I'm not sure about all 3, but at least with Axiom, we're using artificial intelligence to process that data from the existing sensors and to determine whether or not there is a leading indicator of a leak present in that facility, in that system. And so there's a lot of advantages to this strategy as well. The first is that we're able to detect leaks anywhere. So even if it's outside, one of the biggest drawbacks of direct ALD sniffing systems is that you can't detect leaks unless there's a sensor right next to the leak, and definitely not outside. And if you think about a refrigeration system, you must have certain components like the condenser outside. And unfortunately, direct ALD systems simply don't allow detection of leaks on those outside components. And so an indirect system can detect leaks anywhere in the facility, whether it's inside or outside, at very, very low leak rates as well, as low as a quarter pound a day, in some cases even lower. So we're talking very small leaks. This completely eliminates the need for manual leak inspections. So, if you're installing a direct ALD system, there is still the need to do manual leak inspections on components of the system that are located outside the facility, because again, those direct ALD solutions simply are unable, based on how they're built and how they operate, to detect leaks that are occurring outside. And finally, deployment of these software-based solutions are very low cost as software-based pricing. We're not installing new hardware. There's no retrofits. There's no big program management solutions where you're deploying trucks and visiting X number of stores per week and informing store managers, et cetera. It's a fully remote deployment in 100 or more sites per week. So a lot of advantages to both. And obviously, there are a lot of decisions to be made there by each individual grocery chain. So I'm going to hand it over to Stephen now to talk more about compliant refrigerant management plans.
Great. So, essentially there are 3 broad categories that everyone needs to be thinking about in now a broader sense. First is understanding your exposure, then it's updating your standard operating procedures, and then finally it's ensuring that you're doing all of this in an audit-ready way. So in terms of your exposure, determine which assets are included in the Subsection H requirements. Unfortunately, we don't have the final rules yet. any day now, we should know what is the charge size. Are they going to go with 15-pound as proposed? Are they going to increase that maybe to 25-pound? Are they going to decrease that maybe to 5 pounds? Not certain yet, but probably want to have a good sense of what your current asset profile looks like so that you're prepared. Additionally, material types. They have now broadened the material types that fall under these requirements from just ozone depleting substances class 1, class 2 to now incorporating HFCs with GWP of 53 or more. And so making sure that you are understanding what are the charge sizes and what are the material types that are in your fleets so that you can better prepare for what you need to make sure that you're accurately tracking and addressing when these regulations go into effect. So then with that, it's updating your standard operating procedures. You need to perform regular leak inspections and leak rate calculations, and then repair those if the leak rate threshold is exceeded. And as part of that, if those leak rate thresholds that have been proposed by the EPA are exceeded, you either need to have regular manual leak inspections, or you could use an ALD in lieu of those regular leak inspections. So determining what's going to be best for your facilities, for your practices. But either way, making sure that you have some way of regularly confirming what is the leak rate of my equipment so that I can take action, repair as needed, and then report if it falls into that chronically leaking category. And then finally, for assets that are approaching their end of life, if they're chronically leaking, if they're not able to be brought into compliance through repair, then developing those retrofit and retirement plans. Finally is ensuring that you're doing all of this in an audit-ready way. We know that many of you go through painstaking processes to make sure that your assets are managed appropriately, but you want to make sure that you're really buttoned up so that if a regulator comes knocking, you don't need to scramble to get the requisite paperwork together to show that you are managing your plan in a way that is compliant. That includes ALDs as well. And so we've seen and heard some things in the market where customers say, well, I've installed an ALD, so I'm set. And while ALDs are a valuable leak detection method, you still need to make sure that you have the records on hand for when they were installed, and then also that they're regularly calibrated. And so again, making sure that you are getting credit, making sure that all of the actions that you are taking are not only achieving the performance requirements that you all strive for with your assets, but that you're doing so in a way that meets the regulatory requirements so that you are very well prepared in the face of likely increasing enforcement.
Perfect. Thanks, Stephen. I'm going to put out a quick note on the chat. Reminder to add your questions to the Q&A tab in Zoom. We already have some great questions coming in, but I want to remind folks that is available. Make sure that we're covering the things that are most important to the folks who are attending today. So, Stephen, you want to start us off on this one?
At the risk of being repetitive here, the main thing you should do now is understand your exposure. And so make sure that you have a good sense of your asset inventory and specifically a focus on material type and charge size. And so that is the first step. Many of you already have this. Great. Now you can make informed decisions around how much your practices are going to have to expand to meet the broadening kind of surface area of these regulations as enacted by subsection H. But if you're not sure, if you've just been tracking your larger systems, then you're definitely going to want to make sure that in your upcoming service visits or general procedures with your facility managers at the local level, that you are enacting some sort of plan to have a better understanding of your asset inventory so that you're ready to update as necessary.
Yep. Yeah, on the second piece here, this is a critical one. So I can say with great conviction now that doing nothing is no longer an option. So have that conversation with your leadership, with your CFO, with whoever you need to have that conversation with, because you're going to have to do something in 2025. And so this is the point where it's a question of not, am I going to do something, or when am I going to do it? Because the answer is yes, you have to do something, and you have to do it in 2025. Now the question is, what strategy am I going to implement, and who am I going to partner with? And so leading into the next one here, from my standpoint, this is a massive opportunity. And I think that there's a lot of folks in the industry. I know there are a lot of folks who I've spoken to who've told me that this is their opening. This is their opportunity to finally focus on an issue that they've cared about for a long time, and they've known is something that requires a lot of attention and should be focused on. But there were just too many other fires burning at the same time. And so ultimately now the EPA has shoved this to the forefront of everyone's attention. We need to act on it now in order to avoid massive EPA fines and a lot of bad press. And so now this is our opportunity to solve or address this leak rate issue, and really start driving down those leak rates, which are going to also provide massive financial, operational, sustainability benefits beyond just the compliance piece as well. So this is a real opportunity to make some progress against these strategic goals that a lot of folks have had on their list for years and years. This is a big opportunity.
And Amrit, if I could just piggyback off of that, something that may be obvious to everyone here, but as companies really put their emissions profile under the magnifying glass and focus on achieving their sustainability goals, we're seeing that the Scope 1 fugitive emissions from leaking refrigerant are actually increasing as a share of their overall emissions profile. And this is because they're making progress on areas like maybe they're offsetting their energy consumption, or they're switching to renewable sources, or they're electrifying their vehicle fleet, all of which great, important, critical steps. But as a result, when those Scope 2 emissions come down, then the Scope 1 impact is greater as a piece of the overall pie. And I'm certain that anyone for whom this information is relevant certainly meets the materiality threshold that we're seeing in financial reporting and disclosures. So whether that's, I think it's SB 253 in California, or SEC requirements to better track and report on these emissions and progress towards these goals, just kind of worth keeping in mind that the fugitive emissions Scope 1 piece is definitely a growing piece of the overall pie. And so if it hasn't come into focus yet, it's inevitable that it will, especially with these important changes.
Yeah. One other nuance I also want to add here is that sometimes having those conversations with the CFO or with the CEO of your organization can be really difficult, honestly, and seemingly really risky. And so essentially, we can help with how to speak their language if that would be useful. So for example, if we're talking to the chief sustainability officer, talking about greenhouse gas reductions and lowering leak rates from 30% down to 22% and all the incredible megatons of CO2 is going to make them jump up and down. But that same story is not going to make any sense to the CFO. They just don't care. And so helping to build out that business case for the CFO is something that we've done a lot of times at this point. We'd be happy to help out with, because there is an incredibly strong business case for reducing leak rates. No matter how you slice it, it's just good for everyone. There's no downside here to reducing leak rates. Regulations are coming fast. So don't be that retailer that is 30 days before the deadline and you're scrambling to figure out what to do. Not a good look. And it's going to be much more painful and much more expensive. And you don't want to end up with egg on your face or facing huge EPA fines. Just not a good look. Finally here, select vendors carefully. So one thing that Steve and I are going to talk about a little bit more is that there isn't really a one-stop shop for this. Like there's no one vendor that you can go to that can help you comply with everything across the board. It just doesn't exist. And that's because the solution is so multifaceted and requires deep integration with so many different parts of your business. And so this is going to be each retailer coming up with a strategy that makes the most sense for them based on a series of factors we're about to talk about, including folks who are actually boots on the ground repairing leaks and refilling them, software solutions for refrigerant leak tracking and management, automatic leak detection, and so many other elements as well. And there is no one-stop shop for all of that. But basically, choose service providers who can play nice in that sandbox with one another, who understand the complex and shifting requirements and can help to future-proof your operations.
Yeah, I think put differently, refrigerant management is a team sport. And when we look at the stakeholders involved in supporting our clients, obviously it's a huge combination of facilities teams and compliance teams within the organizations themselves. It involves their service providers, which could be a combination of in-house techs and third-party service providers. It could be their technology providers. And kind of bring all of those different pieces together is really critical. And it's going to look a little bit different for every business.
Absolutely. Cool. And so then the question is, what are your priorities to close this all out? So, there's a lot of folks out there where ease and speed of deployment is going to be top of the list. There's no appetite for adding an entirely new project across hundreds and hundreds of sites that requires project management, selecting vendors, coordinating with store managers, site after site after site, a huge, massive Gantt chart with 1,000 lines. So there's a lot of folks where that's going to be critical. ROI is a big one. So are you going for minimum compliance to check that EPA box, or are you looking for the best ROI solution? Those are different answers. Greenhouse gas footprint, ESG, safety obviously is a consideration for a lot of folks. Is there a real trade-off between initial or life cycle costs that folks care about? Availability of carbon credits, which are available in some cases, they're not in others, and can be somewhat meaningful from a financial standpoint to help pay for a lot of these different types of upgrades. Feel free to reach out to us. To me, we work with Therm to help get carbon credits and with a lot of our customers, and other benefits or even combinations of these various factors. And so this is very much going to be, it requires a little bit of reflection here. What is most important to you and your organization? And from there, after defining what your goals are, then it's the right time to begin start and looking for various options and starting to talk to other vendors and get a sense of what's available. So to put this in context of a specific leak, we just talked about this idea that there is no one-stop shop and this is a team sport. And so just to put a finer point on that here, addressing leaks at scale, we view this as a 4-step process. So the first step is finding those leaks. The second is repairing them. The third is confirming, and finally reporting. And so looking at each one of those, there's a variety of different options for identifying leaks. Some of them are more legacy, some of them are newer, and all of them have various pros and cons, which we'll talk more about in Q&A. On the repair side, a leak is identified, you dispatch that work order via your CMMS or your work order management. That repair gets completed by a contractor, whether in-house or third party, and then you refill the gas if necessary. After the fact, and this is an important step that a lot of people miss, is you have to confirm, was that leak actually repaired? And this is a step that's often overlooked because those technicians are typically the folks who are required in many cases to confirm whether or not the leak was repaired, but they're busy solving the next major problem at the next facility, 20 miles away. So they don't have time to go back 2 days later and determine, hey, is this still leaking or not? It kind of gets lost in the noise. And finally, reporting. And so this is getting back to record keeping, being audit ready, and ultimately proactively reporting when required to EPA, to CARB, to other state and federal agencies as required. So looking at the AIM Act, there's a bunch of new requirements across various parts of this overall process. Obviously now on the identification piece, automatic leak detection is now required. On the repair side, as we chatted about briefly, prompt leak repairs are now required, and use of these reclaimed HFC refrigerants are now required according to the draft language. And so a lot of this stuff was required in the past, but the AIM Act is substantially tightening up these requirements. And finally, on the right-hand side here, the reporting and record keeping and logging requirements have increased really substantially, especially for these chronically leaking appliances. So to summarize, the AIM Act is not changing this 4-step process. It's simply making these various steps more rigorous and providing a little bit more federal oversight into these steps. And again, key takeaway here is that there's not a single vendor which can help with all 4 of these. It's going to be a tapestry. It's going to be a team, essentially, to help you accomplish your goals as a retailer, to remain compliant, and also to achieve these other ROI and speed and ease related goals that you may or may not have. So we've done fantastically well on time here. And I guess, Stephen, last question, which steps in this process does Trakref support today?
Yeah, well, I'd say, Trakref helps you remain audit ready for every piece of this 4-step process. And so from an identification standpoint, you want to make sure that whether you're using regular leak inspections or ALDs, that you have a record of both the method that you're using, the fact that it's up to date and calibrated, and that those service events, whether it's an alarm that is triggered or an inspection that takes place, is reported in a way that is audit ready. Next, for repair, obviously you're leaning on your service providers to do that, or your in-house techs, but you want to make sure that those repairs, when that repair happens, that the leak rate is calculated, that it's documented, that if there's a follow-on verification inspection that needs to happen, that all of those important steps across 2 and 3 are conducted. And then, of course, for your reporting, we have exports that are built specifically for things like CARB XML, which is an annual reporting that customers in California need to use, or EPA notifications to let them know about plans as they relate to chronically leaking systems or other methods there. And then, of course, audits happen. And so making sure that if an inspector comes knocking, it's very easy for you to pull all of your information. And we've seen the EPA specifically from note the importance of this record keeping, and then noting that electronic systems make it easier for you to access that at any point in time. And then, I think it's just important to remember that while your techs, whether they're in-house techs or service providers, are critical stakeholders in this process, the ultimate compliance obligation is also on you as the owner and operator. And the environment out there, I'm sure you don't need to hear it from me, is getting more challenging. Refrigerant costs are going up, and the availability of the workforce, quite frankly, is going down. There's a technician shortage in this industry. The compliance requirements are getting harder to manage. The scope of the compliance is growing. And so, it's really critical that not only that you have trusted service providers, but that you have the right tools and systems in place to ensure that this is all being done effectively. Because if your tech goes on site, creates completes the leak repair, but doesn't document it properly for you, that could put you in jeopardy. And so we want to make sure that you have the right steps in place to be ready and to be compliant.
Yep. And then, in terms of Axiom, the steps that we're able to support most directly are, number 1, identification. So that's through the automatic leak detection. Number 3 is confirming. As you can tell, Axiom is not able to complete the full 4-step process for a company, for a grocer or retailer, but Axiom can be incredibly helpful with steps 1 and 3. And then ultimately, part of a team, part of a broader team to support the overall process, kind of exactly like Stephen was talking about. So, yeah, from there, let's go into Q&A. We're getting some great questions coming in here. So let's see. The first is, what is the EPA doing to enforce the AIM Act? Stephen, you want to take this one, or should I?
What I have primarily heard is that there more of a focus on enforcement in the years ahead, which is essentially going to mean more audits. Another piece that I saw written in the proposed language is looking at some standardization of some of the reporting that would be required. And again, standardization is going to make it easier to verify and then conduct audits if necessary. So I do think that that being prepared is the best step that you can take in light of what people are expecting to be increased enforcement here.
Yep. One thing I'll add is that the EPA puts out a set of published enforcement priorities pretty routinely. And within the last year or so, they released their 2024 through 2027 enforcement priorities. And HFC emission reduction was their number 2, I believe, priority on that list of 3 items. So if you think about the entire scope of everything the EPA does, this is a top 3 item for them now in terms of enforcing this regulation. for, again, the entire agency, the entire country. This is a very, very high priority for them. So how are they actually enforcing it? There have been a lot of enforcement actions which have already occurred, that are published and are available. Typically, they don't become published and available until after they're fully resolved, is my understanding. But they come with pretty significant fines in the hundreds of thousands, is what we've seen of the various examples that are published and public at this point. But in addition to that, in each one of these cases, we've seen that there's been, let's say a $500,000 fine, but then $5 million worth of remediation that needs to happen. And so it's less about writing a check to the EPA. It's more about having to allocate a really large pool of money to address the root cause of these problems. And so that's the type of enforcement that we've seen to date on the parts of the AIM Act that have already been in place for over a year at this point. For a subsection H, which is not yet enforced, but should be, supposedly this calendar month starting, we anticipate more of the same. This is a critical part of the overall refrigerant management and leak reduction strategy that the EPA has, and they've made it clear this is a priority. All right, let's see here. What are some disadvantages of indirect ALD? That is a great question. Okay, so what I would say is, the first is, if you're thinking about a direct leak detection system where you have a sniffer, a physical sniffer on site, one of the biggest advantages of that is that it can detect a leak within minutes or even seconds. So if you have a big leak and it's right next to one of these sensors, you can detect that in, let's say, 60 seconds, or on that order of magnitude. With indirect ALD, that response time is measured on a timescale of days. And so it's a very different use case. Basically, if we're dealing with a really big gusher, where you're losing, you have a hole in the liquid line and you're losing 10 pounds a minute, indirect ALD is not going to be a sufficient solution to address that kind of, to detect that kind of issue. It's just simply not going to detect it on a timescale that's relevant. It'll tell you the day after that there was a big leak yesterday, not helpful. But for the other, 90+% of leaks, 95% of leaks that are much slower, that could be measured, and typically the types of leaks that we see are anywhere from a quarter pound per day of gas up to 15 to 20 pounds per day of gas. Those are the type of leaks that are, in so many cases, not caught, not detected by these direct sniffer systems. But the indirect is very good at detecting those on a timescale of anywhere from 1 to 7 days, but we've seen on average around 3 or 4 days to detect that type of leak. And again, 3 to 4 days may sound like a long time, but you think about the status quo where those leaks are never detected until it's too late, until the system is completely run out of gas. That's one of the big advantages, but it's also a key drawback. Pinpointing the location of leaks is something that direct ALD systems are very good at. So if you have a sensor in a specific location and that sensor is reading a high value, the leak is within 6 feet of that sensor. For indirect ALD, in many cases, we're able to tell you, hey, here's exactly which display case the leak is in, or here's exactly which display case lineup the leak is in. But in other cases, if you're dealing with a leak on the liquid side or on the condenser, for example, we're unable to tell you exactly where that leak is. Instead, we're going to be able to tell you, look, there is a leak in this system somewhere, but we can't locate it. And so location identification is a real strength of direct, and it's a real drawback of indirect in some cases, but not in all cases. I think maybe the last kind of key difference here is essentially the safety benefit. So there are these safety requirements which require some sort of direct PPM sensor in place. Again, so that if there's a human safety issue where the refrigerant is filling up the space and it's displacing the oxygen and folks can't breathe, that's when you need that physical sensor in that facility, in that room, at that moment, alarming very loudly and blinking lights, et cetera. That's something that indirect ALD is not meant to do. Indirect ALD is not meant to be a safety system. It's meant to be a refrigerant leak management system. So in other words, helping to lower those leak rates in the aggregate across many sites over time. So different use cases. I would be happy to talk more about your specific situation, though, and your specific goals. And in many cases, we do have recommendations for solutions that include, not just indirect, but sometimes a mix even of having some of those direct point sensors in key locations, such as walk-in boxes or in the refrigerant or in the machine room for safety, And then using indirect ALD to cover the rest of the facility is often an approach that we recommend, depending on how folks' facilities are laid out and what their goals are. Let's go to the next one here. Is there any way to check for leaks on an RTU that are not connected to the EMS? So that's a really good question. If a rooftop unit is not connected to the EMS, there's two issues there. Number one, there's no data available, unless there is a different way to get that data out of the RTU. Number two, that system is located on the roof, so you can't put a sniffer next to it. It's just not effective. You can't sniff a leak that's outside because it's a rooftop unit, so it's on the roof. And so the short answer is that if there is an ability to get data out of that system and input it into the refrigeration controller that's on site, so install some sort of data connection. At that point, then it is possible to use AI to determine whether or not that system is leaking. But that availability of data is critical, as necessary to enable that functionality. Let's see here. What's our next question? Sorry, I lost my... Okay, here's one. Stephen, do you think the election in November will impact this regulation?
The short answer is no. And the reason why is because it is worth noting the AIM Act was signed into law by President Trump in December of 2020 with bipartisan support. This is not to say that any party or person is kind of running on a HFC-oriented platform, but I think what is worth noting is that these regulations don't come out of the blue. These are another step in a series of decades-long partnerships between industry and regulators to transition the industry off of initially ozone-depleting substances to non-ozone depleting substances, and then now from high GWP substances to lower GWP substances. And so ultimately, business thrives on predictability. And I think that enough pieces of the industry have already come together across multiple aspects of the supply chain that these types of regulations, fortunately, kind of live in a more technical domain, free from a lot of the partisan back and forth that could impact other regulations.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Last one here. What data points need to be present in my EMS to have indirect ALD? So the beauty of this entire opportunity for you, the retailer, and for Axiom, the provider, is that you already have everything necessary to enable indirect ALD. The reason is because you already have all these sensors, because you have the central controller that needs to know what's the temperature here, what's the pressure there, is this valve open or closed, is this compressor on, how many unloaders are active, et cetera. So the controller needs all that information. As a result, you already have all these sensors in place. And that controller is already connected to the internet because you need that for alarm monitoring. And so you have everything necessary already. And so one thing that's really cool about indirect ALD is that it's not reliant on PPM sniffers. It is not reliant on analog receiver level sensors or Hansen probes in your receiver. And so you don't need those things. It's incredibly flexible. So if you have a receiver level switch, or you have no sensing at all inside your receivers. If you have PPM sensors, multi-channel, single point, no PPM sensors at all. All those different configurations are okay, and indirect ALD is still possible in each one of those. So would love to connect and learn more about what your situation is, what your goals are. So we're going to pause there. That's the end of our time together today. I really appreciate everyone joining us and participating in this industry conversation. And I'm really excited about what 2025 is going to look like for the industry. If we can be a resource, feel free to reach out anytime. If not, we'll catch you on the next one. And thank you, Stephen, for participating.
Thank you for having me. Take care, everyone.